Most people imagine the time of Jesus as a purely spiritual era. Sandals on dusty roads, sermons on hillsides, miracles, parables, and moral lessons suspended in a distant religious past. But for the people who actually lived in that world, daily life was not defined by theology. It was defined by money, or more precisely, by the constant absence of it. The society into which the historical figure of Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. This is the terrain of financial history, where money, power, and belief intersect, and where nothing is ever as simple as it appears. At the start of the 1st century, Judea existed within the Roman Empire, the most advanced extraction system the world had yet seen. Rome did not conquer territories to develop them. It conquered them to fund the center. Provinces existed to move wealth outward, grain, silver, labor, flowing from the periphery toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those peripheries. That mattered because Judea was not wealthy. It was overwhelmingly rural, agricultural, and economically fragile. Most people lived directly off the land, but not in the modern sense of productive farms. These were subsistence plots, barely large enough to survive. A failed harvest did not mean lower profits. It meant hunger, and Rome did not care. Rome ruled Judea through a combination of local elites and imperial administrators. Client kings like Herod the Great governed with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects, figures such as Pontius Pilate, assumed direct control. Their mandate was not to raise living standards. It was to maintain order and ensure that revenue continued to flow. Taxes formed the backbone of this system, and this is where modern assumptions begin to fail. Today, people think of taxes as something tied to income, growth, or profit. In Judea, taxes were owed regardless of outcome. You paid because you existed. There were land taxes, crop taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and markets. Religious taxes layered on top of imperial ones. Miss a payment, and consequences were immediate. There was no appeals process, no bureaucratic delay. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers, who paid Rome up front for the right to collect. Whatever they extracted beyond that was profit. Abuse was not a flaw in the system. It was the incentive. When people could not pay, they borrowed. Debt saturated the economy. And unlike modern debt, it came with no safeguards, no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest compounded quickly. Land was the collateral. One bad year could trap a family in a spiral from which there was no escape. The pattern repeated endlessly. A farmer planted crops. Weather turned. Harvest failed. Taxes were still due. The farmer borrowed from a local lender, often a wealthy landowner or a temple-connected elite. Interest accumulated. The following year barely recovered. Debt remained. Eventually, the land was seized. The farmer became a tenant on what had once been his own property, or a laborer, or vanished entirely. This was not accidental. It was structural. Over time, land concentrated into fewer hands. Small plots disappeared. Large estates expanded. Wealth clustered around elites aligned with Roman authority and temple administration. The majority slid into permanent precarity. The economy did not simply produce poverty. It reproduced it. There was no state safety net, no unemployment support, no welfare, no public housing. Family was the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it was limited. When too many people fell at once, the system offered nothing. Debt was not just financial. It was social. Losing land meant losing status, security, and identity. A family's future could be erased by drought, a tax increase, or a single unpaid obligation. This is the world into which Jesus was born. And it must be stated clearly, most people were not poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rents. The temple needed revenue. All of that pressure fell on those with the least margin for error. The result was tension. Judea was not peaceful. It was volatile. Rebellions flared repeatedly. Banditry was not merely criminal behavior. It was economic desperation. Movements emerged promising relief, justice, reversal. Messianic expectations did not arise in comfort. They arose in collapse. This is where modern audiences often miss the point. When people listened to teachings about debt forgiveness, release, justice, and reversal, they were not hearing metaphors. They were hearing survival. When the poor were mentioned, it was not abstract compassion. It was their neighbors, their families, themselves. In this context, forgiveness did not simply mean emotional relief. It meant debt cancellation, reset, escape. And escape was rare. The Roman system was designed to be efficient, not humane. It extracted wealth upward with remarkable consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order was maintained. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity did not translate into security. Growth did not lift all boats. It lifted a few and sank the rest. The economy functioned, but it did not heal. Everyone knew this. There was no illusion of fairness, no belief that effort guaranteed safety. Only endurance, resentment, and the hope that something might break the cycle. That hope is where ideas become dangerous. Because when a system is this tight, even small shifts feel revolutionary. Even words can destabilize it. By the time Jesus began speaking publicly, the pressure was already unbearable. The fractures were visible. The anger was rational. This was not background noise. This was the engine. To understand why the system felt so inescapable, you have to examine the institution many believed was meant to protect them, the temple. Today, the temple in Jerusalem is often imagined as a purely religious space. In economic terms, it was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It functioned simultaneously as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay an annual temple tax. It was mandatory. It was enforced. And it had to be paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, because of its consistent silver content. Local currencies were not accepted. Roman coins were not accepted. That meant money had to be exchanged. Money changers facilitated this for a fee. Pilgrims traveling for festivals needed currency conversion. Animals for sacrifice were sold at temple-approved prices. Poverty did not exempt anyone. It only reduced the size of the offering. Religion did not replace Roman taxation. It stacked on top of it. The temple elite were deeply entangled with Roman authority. High priests were not chosen by popular support. They were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. The institution that claimed moral authority also benefited from the same extraction logic that impoverished the population. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. When Jesus spoke about forgiveness, people heard debt relief. When he spoke about release, they heard escape. When he spoke about the kingdom of God, they did not hear abstraction. They heard an alternative order. one in which the existing system was not final. And then came the act that changed everything. The disruption in the temple was not merely religious protest. It was economic confrontation. Overturning the tables of the money changers was an attack on the machinery that monetized access to the sacred. He called it a den of robbers, not because money existed, but because extraction had replaced justice. That crossed a line. Rome tolerated profit. It tolerated teachers. It tolerated critics. What it did not tolerate was instability. Temple authorities understood that unrest during pilgrimage season was dangerous. Crowds plus grievance meant rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus was not just preaching. He was disrupting flows. He was undermining legitimacy. He was destabilizing the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. The conflict was not primarily theological. It was economic and political. The system could tolerate suffering. It could tolerate inequality. What it could not tolerate was a narrative that made people question whether suffering was necessary. Because once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. What followed was not reform. It was escalation. Within a generation, Judea erupted into full revolt. In 70 CE, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was dismantled stone by stone. Its treasury was looted. Its hierarchy erased. Rome rebuilt control on its own terms. Extraction did not end. It intensified. Rome won militarily, but it never fully reclaimed control over meaning. Jesus had not led an army. He did not propose a new tax code. He challenged the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable. And that challenge proved harder to eliminate than any rebellion. Empires survive force. They struggle when legitimacy erodes. The economy of Jesus' time reveals a deeper pattern. Systems do not collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. History does not repeat, but it exposes structure. And once you understand how power defends itself not only with force, but with narratives, it becomes much harder to believe those narratives are accidental. If this analysis reshaped how you see history, power, and money, subscribe to Empire of Money, where we trace the hidden economic systems behind the stories the world thinks it already knows.